George Catlett Marshall was born in 1880 and died in 1959. George Marshall served as Army Chief of Staff during World War II, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and President of the American Red Cross. George graduated from VMI and he served in both World Wars, and in the process, he raised his status to U.S. Army Chief of Staff. After the war, he served as Secretary of State and crafted the Marshall Plan to help Europe recover. By doing this, he earned himself the Nobel Peace Prize. Marshall passed away in Washington, D.C. on October 16, 1959. George was the youngest of three children and initially was a disappointment to both of his parents. He was a disappointment because of his behavior and poor performance in school. When George enrolled at VMI, he commanded success, and his first year was difficult, but he was determined to learn the rules of the military and follow orders. At the end of his first year, he was at the top of his class. Marshall graduated from VMI in 1901. The following year, he married Elizabeth Carter Coles and set out for an 18-month deployment in the Philippines as second lieutenant of the infantry. When Marshall returned, he continued to demonstrate his sharp leadership ability and problem-solving skills, graduating with honors from the Infantry Cavalry School at Fort Leavenworth in 1907 and the Army Staff College in 1908. In 1917, when the United States became involved in World War I, Marshall was chosen to act as Chief of Operations for the 1st Army Division sent to France. While he was there, he served under General John J. Piersings and was a key planner of operations. In November 1945, at the war's end, Marshall resigned his military post, and just days later, President Harry Truman persuaded him to serve as special representative to mediate the Chinese Civil War. Marshall was unable to find a solution. However, and then when China later fell to communism in 1949, Marshall would find himself a target of vicious attacks by anti-communists like Senator Joseph McCarthy. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, President Truman tapped again. But this time, Marshall was being asked to be Secretary of Defense. Due to ill health, Marshall only served 1 year before retiring completely from the public in September 1951. He died in Washington, D.C. on October 16, 1959, at the age of 79.
Dodona Manor has a very long history. It is located in Leesburg, Virginia, and is a National Historical Landmark and a historic house museum. Catherine Marshall, who was George's second wife, bought the house for $16,000 in 1941. Legend has it that Catherine paid the owners $10 to throw away the for sale sign to keep the competition away from the house. This was the only house the Marshalls ever owned, besides their winter house in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Catherine gave the house and the 3.88 acres to her daughter, Molly Wynne, in 1960 while she moved to Pinehurst for permanent residence. When Mrs. Wynne expressed her desire to sell the property in the early 1990s, several prominent Leesburg citizens under the leadership of B. Powell Harrison were concerned that the property might fall into commercial hands and be demolished and urged the town of Leesburg to purchase it. That proved to be impossible, so the citizens formed the George C. Marshall Preservation Fund, later known as the George C. Marshall International Center, and purchased the house for $2.3 million. After the renovations costing more than $4.5 million, the house opened as a museum on Veterans Day in 2005. The house was named Dodona Manor before the Marshalls purchased it. The name comes from a shrine in ancient Greece, where priests and priestesses interpreted the rustling of oak leaves as messages from the gods. Due to the large amount of oak tree located on and around the property, naming the house Dodona Manor seemed appropriate. The Marshall house is unique among historic houses because over 90% of the furnishings and memorabilia in the house were owned and used by the Marshalls and were obtained from Mrs. Marshall's heirs. there is evidence that a two-story house existed on the property with five-course American brickwork in the early 1800s. John Drish, who purchased the property in 1805, added a Federal-style wing with Flemish bond brickwork and keystone arches in the mid-1820s, and gave the property to his son Wilson Drish, who sold it to Fayette Ball, a distant relative of George Washington, in 1855. In 1856, the Reverend Charles Norris, principal of the Leesburg Academy, purchased it. He tried unsuccessfully selling it in 1859, then opened the Loudon Female Collegiate Institute in the house in 1860, after completing an addition to increase the number of bedrooms. Subsequent owners included Sophia Delany, Joseph and Martha Prather, Wallace and Sally George, Yvonne and Ella Pike, and Marcia McCain Allay and Northcutt Allay, who added electricity and indoor plumbing and eventually sold it to the Marshalls. The Marshalls added two bay windows, a stone court, and changed the wooden porch to a more durable brick. And now on to Mark to tell you more about inside the house.
I will be discussing the interior and exterior of the George C. Marshall house. When you initially walk into the house, you are greeted by the wonderful people who work at the Marshall house. They are very helpful and very informative. Our tour guide, Billy, gave us all the answers we needed and answered every question we had. When Russell and I walked up the stairs, we noticed a painting on the wall of George C. Marshall and asked who painted it. Billy, our tour guide, told me it was done by a soldier who had great respect for George C. Marshall, but ended up dying during World War I. Upstairs, there was also a Jack and Jill bedroom and bathroom where George and his second wife, Catherine, slept. In these rooms, you could find George's favorite books and uniforms which he wore on and off the base, and also when he attended special events. Downstairs, there was a famous painting that was given to George from Winston Churchill and a second one from Miss Chow. They painted these themselves and were given as gifts. Churchill and George became very close friends during World War II when George had created the Marshall Plan, which helped repair Europe. The painting from Miss Chow, who was royalty in China, became close friends with George C. Marshall's wife when they visited China. One thing I found slightly interesting is that Miss Chow spoke perfect English and even had a slight southern accent, while her husband didn't speak any English at all. They do not know why this is, but there's speculation that she spent time in America. In the main hall, on the left side of the house, there is a painting of George C. Marshall's son, who had been killed during World War II in Italy. His body was buried in Rome and still remains there to this day. The final part of the house that we saw was outside in the garden and also in the garage. In the garage, there was George C. Marshall's Willie Jeep wagon, which he went to the military bases in order to keep less attention to him. In the garden, there was also a dead man who was buried there in the early 1800s and was supposedly one of the previous owners. This garden was actually where George C. Marshall came to meditate after a long, busy day when he had a small break. The second garden belonged to George C. Marshall's wife, Catherine. This garden was a rose garden. This was where she spent most of her time when she wasn't cooking or cleaning. The Marshall house was where George C. Marshall ended up retiring and living out the last of his days until his death on October 16th, 1959.